Somewhere on the vast Mongolian steppe, roughly 8 centuries ago, a boy was abandoned. His father had just been poisoned by a rival clan. His family was left to starve in the grasslands. He had no horses worth speaking of, no warriors pledging him loyalty, no fortress walls, no treasury. By every measure that his world used to calculate a person's worth, he had nothing. And yet within a few decades, that same boy would command armies that shook China, shattered Persia, stunned Europe, and carved out the largest contiguous land empire in human history. The question that keeps historians awake, and maybe keeps you awake too, is how. How does a discarded child from a broken clan become the man his followers would call the Great Khan of all the Mongols? If you're listening to this to wind down, that's exactly why I make these. So subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling me where you are in the world and what time it is there. I genuinely check them, and every time it's a little astonishing. Someone in Seoul at 2 in the morning, someone in Chicago just after dinner, someone in London on a rainy Tuesday commute. The story of Genghis Khan somehow connects all of that. And if you want the cleanest listening experience, no ads, no background music, just the story, you can follow the channel on Spotify. It's free, it's easy, and the link to support the channel further is down in the description if you feel like it. Now, the steppe. It's almost impossible to overstate how much the landscape shapes this story. The Mongolian plateau in the 12th century was a world defined by grass and wind and distance. Thousands of miles of open land, bitterly cold in winter, scorching in summer, with rivers that could vanish and pastures that could fail. There were no cities in the Mongol heartland, no written laws, no standing armies in any permanent sense. What there was a web of clans, shifting alliances, blood feuds passed down across generations, raids and counter-raids, marriages arranged as political agreements, and an unspoken code that made loyalty the most valuable currency a person could possess, and betrayal the most dangerous force on the steppe. Into this world, a child named Temujin was born, probably around 1162, though historians debate the precise year. He entered life with something rare and something cursed in equal measure. A prestigious bloodline tracing back to a legendary ancestor and a father who made powerful enemies. Those two facts together set everything in motion. The prestige would give Temujin a claim. The enemies would nearly kill him before he could use it. What this story really is at its core is a story about transformation, about how a person forged by betrayal and scarcity builds something entirely new from the pieces of a broken world. Temujin would lose almost everything before he gained anything. He would be enslaved, hunted, abandoned by allies, and forced into the kind of desperation that either destroys a person or clarifies them completely. And then, slowly through a combination of personal magnetism, strategic brilliance, calculated ruthlessness, and an ability to bind people to him in ways that cut across the old clan divisions, he would begin to rise. The arc we'll follow tonight moves in roughly chronological order. We'll start with the world he was born into, the rules of steppe survival, and what clan membership actually meant for someone's life and death. Then we'll move into his early years, the losses, the alliances, the moment a friendship became a rivalry that would define a generation. We'll watch him build something the steppe had never quite seen before, and then use it to send shockwaves across Eurasia that historians are still trying to fully measure. Along the way, we'll pause where the evidence gets genuinely murky, because it does often. The main source for Temujin's early life is a document called The Secret History of the Mongols, written shortly after his death, and it reads somewhere between biography and mythology. Where historians debate what actually happened, we'll say so. This story deserves that honesty, but the broad shape of it, the outcast who unified the steppe, who built the most effective mobile military force the medieval world had ever encountered, who then unleashed it across half the known world. That shape is real and it is remarkable. So settle in. The grass is moving in the wind. It's the 12th century. And somewhere in the eastern steppe, a boy named Temujin is about to lose his father. Before we get to Temujin specifically, we need to spend some time in the world that made him. Because you can't understand what he built without understanding what he was building against, and what he was building from. The Mongolian steppe is not empty. That's the first thing to understand. It looks empty, especially if you're picturing it from above, all that rolling grass stretching to the horizon in every direction, interrupted by nothing more dramatic than a river bend or a ridge of low hills. But it was full of life, full of movement, and full of politics. Every square mile of that landscape was spoken for. Every pasture had a history. Every river crossing had a name that someone's ancestors had given it. The steppe runs in a great arc across the interior of Eurasia, from Hungary in the west, all the way to Manchuria in the east. The Mongolian plateau sits roughly in the middle, and it's high, cold, and extreme in a way that genuinely shapes human behaviour over generations. Winters can kill livestock in days if a family is caught unprepared. Summer droughts can collapse a pasture that looked perfectly healthy in spring. The fundamental fact of steppe life is that you cannot stay in one place. The land won't let you. The grass recovers if you move on. It dies if you don't. So everyone moves constantly, seasonally, predictably enough to plan around, but harsh enough that any disruption to the pattern can be catastrophic. This is why horses aren't just useful on the steppe. They are the technology that makes everything else possible. A person on foot in the Mongolian grasslands is nearly helpless. The distances are too great, the weather too unpredictable, the threats too mobile. But a person on horseback can cover ground that would take days on foot in a matter of hours. They can herd cattle and sheep across seasonal routes, carry their family's belongings in a felt tent called a jur that can be assembled and disassembled in less than an hour, and respond to threats or opportunities faster than any settled army could imagine. Steppe warfare was terrifying to outsiders, not because the Mongols were uniquely cruel, though cruelty certainly had its place, but because the same skills that made them expert herders made them expert raiders. Riding, shooting, navigating long distances, enduring cold and hunger, moving fast and then moving faster. These weren't military training, they were childhood. But mobility creates a political problem. If you can always move, loyalty is always optional. And that is where clan identity comes in. On the steppe, you were not primarily an individual. You were a member of a clan, which was a member of a larger tribal grouping, which was connected through kinship and marriage to a web of other clans spread across hundreds of miles. Your clan was your identity, your protection, your obligation, and your constraint, all at once. When someone wronged you, your clan took the insult personally. When your clan needed warriors, you rode without being asked. The blood feud was not a breakdown of steppe society. It was one of its structural features, a mechanism for enforcing accountability in a world without courts or written law or enforceable contracts. Loyalties shifted constantly. A powerful Khan with a winning streak could attract followers from other clans by offering protection, horses, and the spoils of successful raids. A Khan who lost battles or ran out of gifts watched his followers melt away just as quickly. This was not considered treachery in any simple sense. The steppe had its own logic. You followed strength because strength kept your family alive. You abandoned failure because failure was contagious. This created a world of permanent instability at the top, even as the basic rhythms of herding life continued beneath it. Strong confederacies formed, held together by a charismatic leader with a gift for raiding and redistribution, then fragmented the moment that leader died or faltered. The Tatars, the Khwarezms, the Naimans, the Merkits. These were the major groupings that Temujin would eventually have to contend with, each one a loose confederation of clans that could splinter under pressure or swell with new recruits depending on the fortunes of their leaders. At the edges of this steppe world sat the great settled civilizations, the Jin dynasty ruling northern China, the various kingdoms and empires of Central Asia further west. The relationship between the steppe nomads and these settled neighbours was complicated and mutually dependent in ways that both sides preferred not to fully acknowledge. The steppe needed iron, grain, silk, and luxury goods that nomadic life couldn't produce. The settled powers needed the steppe to stay fragmented because a unified nomadic confederation was an existential threat to any agricultural state on their border. So the Chinese in particular played a deliberate game, subsidizing certain steppe leaders, withholding support from others, encouraging rivalries and keeping the grasslands divided. A powerful Khan on the steppe was a problem. 3 moderately powerful Khans fighting each other were a solution. Trade ran through all of this. The Silk Road and its branches passed through or near steppe territory, and nomadic groups could profit enormously from taxing or raiding that traffic, or from serving as guides and escorts across terrain that terrified settled merchants. Prestige goods moved through these networks constantly. Fine silk robes that signified status, lacquered Chinese goods that marked a leader as someone with reach and connections. These objects weren't just beautiful, they were political signals. When a Khan gave a follower a silk robe stripped from a defeated enemy, he was saying something precise. I win, I distribute, I make you valuable by association with me. Marriage alliances worked in the same register. On the steppe, marriage was not a private arrangement between 2 people. It was a treaty. A clan that gave a daughter to another clan was creating an obligation, a bond of loyalty that was supposed to hold even when raiding pressure or resource competition made conflict tempting. Bride wealth, the goods paid by the groom's family to the bride's family, was the material expression of that bond. A man who could afford high bride wealth was demonstrating prosperity and seriousness. The exchange of women between clans knit the patchwork of steppe society together in ways that pure military alliance couldn't, because it created blood ties that persisted across generations. It also created one of the steppe's most persistent sources of violence. Stealing a bride, as actually happened in Temujin's own family story, was not just an insult. It was a declaration that your clan was strong enough to take what it wanted, and an invitation to a cycle of retaliation that could last decades. Above all of this, holding the whole world together spiritually, was Tengri, the eternal blue sky, the supreme deity of the steppe, not a god who demanded temples or elaborate ritual, but a cosmic force whose favour expressed itself through victory, through weather, through the growth of herds. A Khan who won battles was not simply skilled, he was Tengri favoured, operating under a kind of celestial mandate that justified his authority in terms every nomad understood. Beneath Tengri sat a whole world of spirits, nature forces inhabiting rivers and mountains, ancestral presences that required propitiation, shamans who served as intermediaries between the human world and the invisible one. These shamans, called Bu or Buo, were political figures as much as spiritual ones. They could declare omens that validated or undermined a leader's campaigns. They could perform rituals that bound warriors together before a battle. In a world without written law, spiritual legitimacy was as real and as consequential as military power. What this adds up to is a world of extraordinary vitality and extraordinary fragility at the same time. The steppe produced extraordinary warriors, sophisticated political minds, and long-distance networks that moved goods and people across Eurasia with surprising efficiency. but it also produced a ceiling. Unification was rare because the same forces that made steppe leaders powerful, the ability to attract followers by distributing loot, the requirement that loyalty be earned continuously rather than assumed, the absence of any fixed institutional structure that outlasted its founder, all of those forces worked against permanence. When a great Khan died, the confederation usually died with him. That's what made what Temujin eventually built so genuinely strange. He didn't just conquer the steppe, he found a way to break that ceiling. But that comes later. First, he had to survive long enough to try. Temujin entered this world already entangled in that web of blood and obligation. He was born sometime in the late 1160s, near the Onon River in northeastern Mongolia, into the Borjigin clan. Later chroniclers, especially the Persian historians writing for his descendants, will trace that clan's lineage back to a blue-grey wolf and a fallow doe who crossed a sacred sea. That isn't biology, it's politics. When steppe aristocrats tell origin stories, they're not trying to convince you that wolves literally had human children. They're making a claim. We are old. We are chosen. We are close to Tengri. The name we know him by, Temujin, comes to us from the secret history of the Mongols, a chronicle compiled after his death. According to that tradition, he was named after a captured Tatar warrior, Temujin Uge, taken by his father on a raid not long before the birth. There are different readings of this. Some linguists see the root temur, iron, in there, making it something like blacksmith or of iron. Others suspect the Tatar's name simply sounded impressive and victorious, and victory is a good omen to attach to a newborn son. This is one of the patterns you'll notice again and again in Temujin's story. The sources preserve details that may be literally true, metaphorically true, or politically useful, often all at once. Being named for a defeated enemy ties his life, from its very first breath, to the idea of conquest. It might be history, it might be hindsight. On the steppe, those two things are rarely cleanly separated. His father, Yesuge, was not a great Khan, but he was not a nobody either. He led a small lineage within the Borjigin, ranked among the minor aristocracy of the steppe. He rode with powerful allies, he could take captives in battle, he had wives and concubines and a network of obligations that stretched beyond the horizon Temujin would have seen as a child. In steppe terms, Temujin was born with advantages: a known name, a recognized father, brothers who would ride beside him when they came of age. Then one decision set the whole fragile structure shaking. When Temujin was about 9, Yesuge arranged a marriage for him, as was customary. The bride was Bert from the Ongirat, a well-connected neighbouring group. She was not a random choice. The Ongirat had ties to other powers. Marrying into them could anchor Yesuge's line inside a larger confederation, increase his access to pasture, horses, allies. So father and son rode to deliver the boy to his future in-laws, to be raised there until he was old enough to take Bert as wife. On the way back from that journey, Yesuge accepted hospitality from a camp of Tatars. The secret history says they recognized him as an enemy because he had once killed one of their chiefs. They offered him food laced with poison, then let him ride away. He made it home, but not for long. The symptoms described in the chronicle, sudden illness after a shared meal, rapid decline, fit the story. It might have been poison. It might have been some other disease. What matters is that he died quickly, and Temujin was not there to claim his place. This is where the abstract rules of steppe politics become brutally concrete. Yesuge's followers, the men who had eaten his meat and drunk his kumis, weighed their options. Staying loyal to a dead man's widow and small children meant years of risk and reduced raiding prospects. Switching allegiance to a stronger, more immediately rewarding leader meant safety and spoils now. You know by now how those calculations usually came out. They left. Temujin's mother, Hoelun, found herself on the steppe with several small children, no adult male protector, and no real claim on the loyalty of the wider Borjigin or their allies. In the language of the sources, the family was cast out, driven to the social margins. Their herds were taken, their felt tents, their movable wealth, their senior status in the camp hierarchy. All of it was stripped away. They didn't vanish from the landscape, they just fell to the very bottom of it. The secret history describes years of hunger in fairly stark terms. The children gather roots, wild onions, berries, they fish. They hunt small animals and, when game is scarce, other people's small animals. There's an almost painful sense that everything you do is marginal, improvised, just enough to get through one more winter. A family that had once ridden under banners and received guests now lives like poachers on land they used to consider theirs. This is the part of Temujin's life that historians often point to when they talk about his ability to read people, to evaluate danger quickly, to calculate who could be trusted and who could not. Growing up with no safety net on the steppe forces a specific kind of intelligence. You learn to see which man in a camp actually has followers and which just pretends. You notice who shares food with your family when they don't have to, and who looks away. You learn that the clan system is a shield if you're inside it, and a knife if you are not. Inside this pressure cooker, tensions within the little exiled household grew. Temujin had an older half-brother, Beta, and a younger one, Belgute. Beta was the son of another wife of Yesugei's, and in the harsh logic of inheritance and seniority, he could claim authority over the younger children and even over Hoelun herself. The secret history portrays him as throwing this weight around, taking game the younger boys had hunted, asserting his rights in ways that felt, to a hungry adolescent Temujin, like theft. At some point, probably in Temujin's mid-teens, he and Belgute ambushed Beta and killed him. The chronicle frames it almost as a confession. Hoelun, their mother, is furious. She knows exactly what they've done. They have spilled the blood of an elder brother, violated a core steppe norm in which internal hierarchy among male kin was supposed to remain intact even when food was scarce. For the boys, it was an act of desperation. Beta represented not just a bully, but a rival for the scant resources and authority the family had left. Killing him removed that rival. Later tradition sometimes wraps this moment in inevitability, as if Temujin was pruning a family tree already marked for greatness. It's probably more small-scale and human than that. A starving teenager kills the person standing between him and food, and only later does that act become part of a legend about iron will and ruthless clarity. Still, it tells us something about Temujin's emerging view of power. Formal seniority means nothing if you can't enforce it. Blood is important, but not sacred. In a world that has already broken every promise it made to you, the only security you recognize is what you can hold and defend, with your own hands and with the loyalty of the people closest to you. At some point in these years, the outside world reached in again, violently. The family had enemies. One of the most enduring stories is that the Taich Yud, a rival branch related to the Borjigin, captured Temujin while he was still young. Depending on the version you read, this is either punishment for his father's past politics, an attempt to neutralize a potential rival, or simply the kind of opportunistic kidnapping that happened when a vulnerable teenager from a noted bloodline wandered within reach. The secret history gives us a vivid account. Temujin, bound in a wooden collar, paraded between households, forced to serve, watched carefully. Then a daring escape, aided by a sympathetic man of lower rank who hides him in a river or a reed bed, defies his own chiefs, and helps Temujin slip away into the dark. Historians tend to treat the broad outline, capture, some period of constraint, eventual escape as plausible. The exact details have the feel of a story polished in the telling, each retelling sanding off the rough edges, adding moral clarity. The kind helper becomes an early example of Temujin's charisma, his ability to inspire loyalty across class lines. The escape itself becomes a sign that Tengri is watching this boy, that fate will not allow him to die in a stranger's camp. What matters for our purposes is not whether every plank of the collar or every whispered conversation happened exactly as described. It's the pattern that emerges when you look at all these episodes together. Temujin grows up in a world where every structure that is supposed to protect him fails. His father's status evaporates the moment the man himself is gone. His clan abandons him when he needs them most. Inside his own family, the person with formal seniority becomes enough of a threat that Temujin chooses fratricide over submission. Even captivity doesn't follow the expected script, because the guards who should be unshakably loyal can be persuaded to risk everything for him. The lesson a mind like his might draw from this is stark. Security is not a gift of birth. It is not guaranteed by being Borjigin or by having a famous father, or by trusting in abstract ideas of kinship. Security comes from loyalty that you can see, test, and, if necessary, enforce. From creating bonds that go deeper than convenience, but also from making sure that breaking those bonds has consequences. Later, when Temujin begins to gather followers, he will do something unusual for the steppe. He will try to build a system in which loyalty runs not just through the veins of a clan, but directly between a leader and his men, cross-cutting old ties, backed by strict discipline and deliberate rewards. You can see the shadow of that system already here in the hungry boy by the river, in the crack of a brother's death, in the weight of a wooden collar on a teenage neck. Before he can build anything like that, though, he still has to claw his way from exile to relevance. And that path runs through a single fragile word: friend. On the steppe, friend could mean more than we usually let it mean. There was a word for it: ander. Chronicles gloss it as sworn brother, blood brother. But it's not just kids cutting their palms and mixing a few drops. In a world where clan ties already bound you to dozens of cousins and uncles, ander was something else. It was a chosen kinship that was supposed to sit on top of the ones you were born with. An ander shared your fortune. If you became a Khan, his rise was tied to yours. If you were destroyed, he was supposed to ride with you to the end. Somewhere in his early teens, as he staggered back from capture and hunger towards some semblance of a future, Temujin found one. The boy's name was Jamukha. The secret history remembers them meeting as adolescents, and quickly forming a bond that both later men will claim as central to their lives. They ride together, they herd together, they share a single cloak against the cold. One famous scene has them sleeping under it and saying, in that half-poetic way steppe sources like, "We were like two colts with one halter." It might be embroidery. It might also be how two boys actually spoke in a night camp, when the fire burned low and dreams still outnumbered obligations. Jamukha was no exile. He came from a powerful aristocratic line within the Jadaran, well connected among the Kamag Mongol elite. If Temujin's family had once been modestly placed and then stripped of almost everything, Jamukha's people were still in the room where decisions were made. When they swore ander, Temujin was binding himself to someone who, on paper, could open doors that had slammed shut on him and his brothers. What did Jamukha see in Temujin? The sources written when the outcome is already known make it sound inevitable. Greatness recognizes greatness. Reality was probably more ordinary. Jamukha saw a tough, hungry boy with a famous name and no backing. Somebody who could be a useful ally later, or at least an interesting companion now. Temujin saw a lifeline back toward relevance and maybe also the first person outside his own family who chose him, not his blood. For a while the bond seems to have been genuine. But Anda was not the only relationship that would shape Temujin's next steps. There was also an older man, a different kind of connection, rooted not in shared hardship, but in the older, more formal language of patronage. His name in the Mongol tradition is Togrul, Khan of the Kirat. Chinese sources will later call him Wang Khan, king, after they grant him a title. At this point, he is one of the most powerful rulers on the eastern steppe, controlling rich pastures, trade routes, and, crucially, prestige. He is also part of Temujin's inherited network. Years earlier, Yesugei had helped Togrul regain his throne. In return, Togrul had sworn brotherhood with Temujin's father a step higher even than Anda, not boys, but grown Khans binding their fates. After Yesugei's death and the Borjigin collapse, that tie mostly lay dormant. Togrul had his own enemies to worry about. A destitute widow and her children could be pitied at a distance and quietly forgotten. Only when Temujin began trying to reassert himself did the old promise become relevant again. The catalyst was a small felt cart moving across the grass, and the woman inside it. Berta, the girl Temujin had been pledged to before his father's death, did not vanish from his story when he was cast out. After some years of struggle, he managed to claim her as wife and bring her into his ragged little following. This alone says something about steppe politics. Her clan, the Ongirat, saw enough future in him to honour the bargain, even when his tent was small and his herds thin. Not everyone was pleased. The Merkits, a neighbouring group with their own grudges against Yesugei's line, saw an opportunity. According to the secret history, they remembered that Yesugei had once carried off a Merkit woman, Hoelun, Temujin's mother, making Temujin literally the child of an old kidnapping. Now, when Temujin was still weak, they staged what looks like a deliberate act of revenge in the language of the steppe. They raided his camp by night, scattered his supporters, and abducted Bertie. For a man trying to rebuild a position, this was not just a personal disaster. It was a political catastrophe. A wife was central to alliance-making, inheritance, and household stability. Losing Bertie like that made Temujin look small, vulnerable, unable to protect the woman who symbolized his link to a larger world. He could have accepted it, claimed fate, and slipped further into obscurity. Instead, he did something that marked a turning point. He went to Jamukha. He went to Togrul. To Jamukha, he appealed as an Anda. Help me as a brother. To Togrul, he arrived as the son of an old ally. You swore brotherhood with my father. Stand by his blood now. Both men agreed. They gathered riders, not hundreds of thousands, but enough that when they moved together the Merkits could not just laugh and ride away. The joint campaign that followed is one of the first moments where Temujin steps back onto the larger map. Together, the three forces strike the Merkits, defeat them, and recover Bertie. By then, months have passed. She is pregnant. The child she carries, Jochi, will always live under a shadow of uncertain paternity. Mongol tradition insists Temujin acknowledged him fully. Gossip in every age is less generous. What matters for Temujin's trajectory is something else. The rescue shows that when he calls, people now answer. Not just a few impoverished kinsmen, but a great Khan like Togrul, and a high-born Anda like Jamukha. For once, the web of obligation that had always failed him works in his favour. And in the wake of the raid, men start to notice him. Some of the warriors who rode with Togrul and Jamukha come away, impressed not just by the victory, but by the young man at the centre of it, the one who had the courage to demand help, and then the sense to distribute spoils and thanks in a way that feels different. When captives are taken, when loot is divided, Temujin is remembered as giving shares to men who fought well, even if their birth was low. He listens to the advice of a commoner or a minor retainer if it is sharp and useful, not just to the sons of chiefs. This is where we begin to see the contrast that will, over the next decade, turn into a fault line. Jamukha embodies the older aristocratic model. In that world, noble birth is not just a fact, it is an argument. Your right to lead comes from who your ancestors were and how many high-status patrons you can claim. Loyalty runs along bloodlines and client networks. A chief rewards his own, and the humbler herdsmen and warriors follow as part of that package, not as individuals. Temujin, shaped by exile and the memory of being abandoned by those who should have protected him, leans in another direction. He still understands blood. He still values big names when he can get them. But again and again, the chronicles show him elevating men because of what they do, not who their grandfathers were. A guard who once hid him from his captors, a blacksmith, a cook, a minor herdsman with a good eye for horses. These men begin to find places close to him, seated nearer at feasts than some better-born cousins. On the steppe, this is not an abstract ideological difference. It changes where food and honour and daughters in marriage go. It reshapes the daily texture of camp life, and people notice. Some of Jamukha's followers drift toward Temujin. A few of Toghrul's retainers, impressed by the younger man's decisiveness and generosity, attach themselves more to him than to the aging Khwarezm Khan. Temujin's own band widens slowly to include men from other clans, and even in some cases minor figures from groups that had once been enemies of his line. For those invested in the old order, this looks dangerous. A man who ignores fine distinctions of pedigree might ignore other, more sacred boundaries. To the desperate and the ambitious lower down the hierarchy, it looks like a miracle. Here is a leader for whom merit might actually matter. For a few years it holds together. Temujin rides beside Jamukha as friend and ally. He stands under Toghrul's shadow as junior partner. Raids are planned together. Enemies are hit. Herds taken. Captives divided. The world could, in theory, have settled into a new balance with Temujin as one respected noble among many, his rough edges smoothed by the expectations of aristocratic society. But that is not the story we have. The same qualities that made Temujin compelling also made him threatening. His growing band, his insistence on rewarding ability over rank, his habit of keeping his word to even low-born followers, all of this began to pull people away from their old loyalties and toward him personally. In steppe politics, gravity like that is rarely tolerated for long. Toghrul's advisors whisper that the young Borjigin is getting too strong, that the old promise to Yasuge has already been more than fulfilled. Among Jamukha's inner circle, resentment hardens. Why should a man born to hunger and humiliation now stand alongside a Jadaran noble as equal? Why should men of good birth have to compete with nobodies for a leader's favour? The Anda bond, which had seemed unbreakable when they huddled under a single cloak, starts to strain under the weight of adult ambition and aristocratic fear. Soon it will snap. When it finally snapped, it did so along lines that had been visible for years if anyone had wanted to see them. The first open break with Jamukha, sometime in the mid-1180s, is remembered as a clash between two ways of being a Khan. On one side, Jamukha, riding with the weight of aristocratic expectation behind him, calling the old families to his banner. On the other, Temujin, drawing in those who were tired of waiting generations for a chance that might never come. The secret history, written long after, makes the conflict feel moral, almost inevitable. Jamukha is cast as cruel and haughty, Temujin as stern but fair. Reality was probably muddier. Both men could be ruthless. Both could be generous. Both used violence to send messages. But there is a pattern in how Temujin's camp remembers the difference, and it has to do with discipline, with rules, and with who was allowed to matter. Steppe war in its older form was a storm, a raid hit like weather, sudden, overwhelming, then gone. Loot went first to the nobles and their closest retainers, then trickled down. Punishments were often personal, arbitrary, tied to a chief's mood or private grudges. You stayed close to your clan because only your own would reliably look out for you. Temujin had seen what that world did to people like his mother. He had watched alliances dissolve the moment they became inconvenient. So when he finally moved from being just another ambitious noble to someone trying to build something bigger, he began where his own life had broken, with predictability. The chronicles emphasize it over and over. Under Temujin, there were rules. If you stole a horse, there was a known penalty. If you deserted in battle, if you betrayed a comrade, if you lied about spoils, you could expect the same response whether you were a cousin of Temujin himself or some nameless archer. That last part is probably idealized. No human society has ever been perfectly blind to status. But the direction of travel seems clear. He wanted men to feel that outcomes followed patterns, not just whims. And where there are predictable punishments, there are also predictable rewards. If a common herdsman spotted a weak point in the enemy line and charged at the right moment, he might come away not only with plunder, but with a share in future decisions, a seat closer to the centre of camp. Capturing a brave enemy could earn you a place in the guard. Bringing good advice at the right time could change your life. Temujin is remembered as repeating a simple idea. I repay loyalty with loyalty. I repay betrayal with vengeance. Again, probably polished in retelling, but it fits the larger pattern. Men followed him not because they thought he was kind, but because he was legible. This clarity extended to enemies. Earlier, Khans had long incorporated captured people, women, children, useful craftsmen. That was standard practice on the steppe. What seems to have been different under Temujin was the scale, the speed, and the offer he made to fighting men. When he broke a camp or shattered a rival unit, he did not always slaughter the survivors or leave them to starve. He often gave them a choice. Bend the knee, join my banner, accept my rules, and you can live, sometimes even prosper. This was not humanitarianism in any modern sense. It was engineering. Every time he pulled defeated warriors into his following, he weakened rival lineages and thickened his own ranks. Instead of waiting for boys to grow up among his herds, he absorbed ready-made horsemen who already knew how to live and fight on the grass. In a landscape of perhaps 1 million or 2 people scattered over immense distances, this policy let his strength grow faster than birth rates alone could ever have allowed. But he did not let these new men simply slot back into their old structures. Here is where the idea of decimal organization enters the story, the famous tens, hundreds, thousands and 10,000s that later chroniclers will describe as the skeleton of the Mongol army. According to those sources, Temujin took existing bands and broke them up, reassembling them into units of 10 households, then grouping those into hundreds, and so on. Crucially, these units were supposed to mix clans. Men from once hostile groups found themselves eating from the same pot, responsible for each other's behaviour, answerable together for cowardice or disobedience. Historians still argue about the timing and completeness of this system. Some think the fully articulated tens to 10,000 scheme only solidified after Temujin took the title Genghis Khan. Others see its outlines already in these early years, when he was experimenting with new ways to hold a diverse coalition together. But even if later writers smoothed the story into something neater than reality, the core idea is plausible. Use organization not just to command troops, but to rewrite loyalty. A unit of 10 was not just a squad, it began to function like a small foster family. Men would share risks, spoils, and sometimes households. If one died, the others were expected to care for his dependents. If one fled in battle, the others might be punished with him. Your fate was no longer tied only to your blood relatives. It was bound to the group Temujin had assigned you. This could feel oppressive. It also created something precious on the steppe, cross-cutting ties that could outlast a single raid, a single season, even a single khanship. At the centre of all this machinery were individuals, trusted lieutenants, whose names echo through the sources: Boorchu, Jelmi, Subade, Jabe, and many others. Some came from humble backgrounds. Some had once fought against him. What united them, in the way the chronicles tell it, is personal loyalty proved under pressure. A man who had untied Temujin's horse when he was a desperate youth, a warrior who had stayed by his side when he was wounded, an enemy archer whose shot had nearly killed him but who then accepted his pardon. These stories blur fact and legend. But they show what the Mongol memory chose to emphasize. Not lineage, not pedigree, but decisive acts of faithfulness or courage that Temujin never forgot. He worked constantly to knit these men to him in more ways than one. He married their daughters into his family. He granted them shares of plunder and prisoners. He put them in charge of key units, then rotated those units so that no one lieutenant could quietly build a rival power base of his own. Oaths were renewed, feasts were held where old services were publicly praised. In a world where betrayal was a familiar weather pattern, Temujin tried to make staying true a better bet. He did not rely on fear and rewards alone. He talked. The same sources that describe brutal massacres also mention careful diplomacy. Before attacking, Temujin sometimes sent envoys with offers: submit, send hostages, share pasture, and you can keep your position under my overarching authority. Those who accepted often found him, at least at first, surprisingly lenient. A once proud chief might retain his local standing, so long as he acknowledged Temujin's supremacy, provided riders when called, and obeyed the new rules. Those who resisted and then fell were treated very differently: heads on stakes, boiling cauldrons, the annihilation of whole lineages. These grim scenes also appear in the record. The contrast was the point. Mercy, when it came, was calculated. It signalled to wavering neighbours that there was a soft landing available if they chose it early enough. Cruelty, when deployed, was equally deliberate, aimed at knitting his followers together in shared fear and shared guilt, and at teaching distant observers that resistance could be fatal not just to leaders, but to their people. Over time, these policies, merit and discipline within, selective mercy and terror without, incorporation of enemies into a steadily reorganized host, began to produce something unusual on the steppe. Not just a big following, but a different kind of power, broader, more structured, less dependent on a single clan's prestige. How much of this was Temujin's conscious design, and how much was later back projection by chroniclers eager to show their founding Khan as a master strategist? It is hard to say with certainty. The secret history was written for his descendants. Chinese and Persian accounts often admired Mongol effectiveness and tried to explain it in their own bureaucratic languages. They may exaggerate order where reality was messier, or attribute to one-moment reforms that actually unfolded over years. Still, even behind the idealization, certain outlines stay consistent. People who lived through the rise of Temujin remember a shift from leadership based mostly on inheritance and habit to leadership that claimed, at least, to rest on rules that applied across birth lines, from temporary coalitions to something that felt more like an institution, from scattered storms of riders to an army that could be broken and reassembled like a tool. When the old order finally decided they could not tolerate this any longer and moved to crush him, they were not just fighting a man. They were riding against this new shape in the grasslands, this half-finished architecture of discipline and promise, and that, more than any one battle, would decide whether Temujin remained a survivor or became something else entirely. They came at him in pieces, but the danger was whole. The first were the Tatars, old enemies of the Mongols, favoured allies of the Jin dynasty to the south. In Temujin's childhood, Tatar warriors had helped engineer his father's death. The insult had been simmering for decades, braided together with the practical problem that the Tatars controlled key pastures and trade routes. By the time Temujin moved against them, he was no longer a wandering exile. He had a following, a reputation, and crucially an alliance with the Kherate Khan, Togrul, whom he called father. Together they struck the Tatars hard, with Jin encouragement. The sources remember ambushes at feasts, surprise attacks at dawn, whole Tatar camps overrun in storms of hoofbeats and arrows. The aftermath is where Temujin's particular cruelty and particular logic show through. The Tatars as a named people disappear from the record after this. According to some chronicles, Temujin ordered that every Tatar man taller than the height of a cartwheel be killed. Children and women were divided among his followers, folded into Mongol households, their names and clan lines dissolved. Whether the numbers are exact is impossible to say. The pattern is clearer. A chronic feud was ended not by a treaty, but by erasure. The memory of that erasure, though, was carefully kept, proof to friends and enemies alike that Temujin could close books that had been open for generations. Next came the Kherate themselves. Alliances on the steppe were never permanent, but the break with Togrul feels, in the sources, like a family tragedy. For years Temujin rode under Kherate banners. They rescued each other, shared victories, married into one another's houses. But as Temujin's influence grew, Kherate nobles whispered that their Khan was being overshadowed by his junior partner. The details are murky and heavily coloured by hindsight. Ambushes were planned, messages were intercepted or faked. There are stories of a night attack in heavy fog where Kherate and Mongol units blundered into each other, half-blind, killing former comrades in the chaos. However, the sequence actually played out. The result was that the old father, Khan, found himself hunted by the man he had once sheltered. Togrul tried to flee to the west and was killed, unrecognised, by a Naiman patrol, who saw only a tired old man in unfamiliar clothes. Temujin, who had called him kin, now broke the Kherate elite, with the same mixture of severity and absorption he had used on the Tatars. Many top families were executed, others accepted subordinate roles under the new order. Ordinary Kherate herders and warriors were scattered into decimal units, their old loyalties diluted. Another steppe power, one that had loomed large when Temujin was a child, was reduced to a memory living on only in a few surviving lineages and borrowed customs. The Merkits, who had kidnapped his wife Berta years before, never quite assembled into a single decisive confrontation. They were hit and hit again in a series of campaigns spanning years. Temujin hunted them down as they fled north and west, sometimes cooperating with other tribes, sometimes turning on those same partners once the Merkits were broken. By the end, the word Merkit too begins to fade from the sources as a living political label. They had been scattered into other peoples, their chiefs mostly killed, their remaining warriors absorbed into the growing Mongol host. Last stood the Naimans, often portrayed as the most formidable of his steppe rivals. They held lands to the west, commanded significant forces, and had close ties with other powers across Central Asia. If the Tatars were an old blood feud and the Kherate a broken partnership, the Naimans were the final exam. The decisive clash came somewhere near the Altai, around the turn of the 13th century. Later accounts speak of elaborate manoeuvres, feigned retreats, and a Nayman army that fought stubbornly but could not match Mongol discipline and coordination. Jibi and Sube'etei appear in these stories as rising stars leading flanking attacks, striking from unexpected angles. The Nayman Khan Taiyang is said to have died in the fighting. His son Kuchluk fled west, a loose end who would cause trouble later in another corner of the world. Here again the pattern repeats. Defeated Nayman units faced hard choices. Resist and die, or submit and be integrated. Craftsmen, scribes and religious figures were taken into Temujin's orbit. Some of the administrative skills that would later help run an empire may have come in part from these captured specialists. The military rank and file were slotted into the same reorganized system as everyone else. By this point, Temujin had done something rare on the steppe. The obvious alternative poles of allegiance, the major rival tribes that had once offered Mongol nobles other banners to ride under, were weakened, scattered, or gone. There were still independent clans, still stubborn chiefs in distant valleys, but no clear competitor with comparable reach. The storms that had once blown in many directions were beginning to swirl around a single centre. And so, in 1206, on the banks of the Onon River, the Kurultai was called. Imagine tens of thousands of people gathered, nobles, warriors, shamans, envoys from far-off allies and frightened neighbours, herds spread out over the hills. Years of war had led to this. The great men of the steppe debated, bargained, tested the wind. At the end they raised Temujin up and gave him a new name, Genghis Khan, Genghis Khan, as it's often rendered in English. What exactly Chingiz meant at the time is still argued over. It may have carried senses of universal fierce or oceanic, implying breadth, depth, inexhaustible power. Whatever its precise nuance, it marked a shift. Temujin was no longer just a leading Mongol noble. He was proclaimed Great Khan of all the Mongols, a title that aspired to encompass every clan and pasture that could be reached by a horse in full gallop. With the title came structures meant to make that ambition real. He formalized an imperial guard, the Keshig, drawn from the sons of leading families and from proven commoners whose loyalty had been tested. On the surface, they were bodyguards and household troops. In practice, they were also hostages and apprentices, the children of potential rivals living close under his eye, absorbing the habits and expectations of the new court. He tightened the decimal system, clarifying chains of command. Tens answered to hundreds, hundreds to thousands, thousands to tumens of 10,000. Commanders could be appointed and removed by the Khan, not just by clan consensus. The same structure that organized raids could now be used to raise vast armies quickly, across a territory that stretched far beyond his childhood range. Law, too, took on a more explicit, if still somewhat misty, form. Later sources speak of the Yasa, a great code of laws issued by Genghis Khan. They describe rules about theft, adultery, military discipline, the treatment of envoys, religious toleration. Some paint the Yasa as a single unified document, promulgated at 1206, written down and jealously guarded. Others hint at a looser collection of decrees, customs and precedents that accumulated over his lifetime. Modern historians tend to be cautious. There is little direct contemporary evidence of a bound law book. It is more likely that Yasa referred to a body of authoritative rulings, decisions the Khan made, often in council, that then became binding custom. Some may not have been written down at all, but were memorized and passed along by officials and judges. Different courts in different generations probably invoked the Yasa of Genghis Khan to give weight to rules that had evolved over time. What matters for our story is less the exact format and more the intent. Genghis Khan wanted people across a sprawling, diverse realm to know that certain behaviours would reliably bring certain responses, whether they were herdsmen on the steppe or merchants on caravan routes. You did not have to love him. You did have to understand the rules. In the space of a few decades, then the outcast child of a broken family had overseen the destruction or subordination of his major rivals, been acclaimed with a title that claimed universal authority among the Mongols, built a standing guard, hardened chains of command, and stamped his will into a developing legal tradition. The steppe, for a brief moment, was more unified than it had been in living memory. Horses were plentiful, warriors were drilled, the machinery of conquest was humming, tuned and tested. The obvious question hung in the air, as persistent as the wind over the grass. What does such a machine do, once it has no more serious enemies at home? The answer, for Genghis Khan, lay outward. When people picture Mongol warfare, they often imagine a single image: a rider at full gallop, bow raised, loosing arrows into a crowded, helpless mass. That image is not entirely wrong, but it is only a fragment of a much larger system. Start with the horse and the bow. An ordinary steppe rider was not just someone who could sit in a saddle and shoot. He had been on horseback since childhood, learning to stand in the stirrups, twist at the waist, fire in almost any direction without breaking speed. The composite bow he carried was a piece of slow accumulated engineering, wood, horn and sinew glued together, cured and shaped to hold enormous tension. In the dry, cold steppe climate, these bows could throw an arrow with enough force to punch through armour at distances that surprised their enemies. Each warrior typically had several horses, remounts that could be swapped during a long day's ride. It sounds like a small detail, but it changes everything. An army with one horse per man can move fast for a short time and then must rest. An army where each rider has 3 or 4 can maintain a high pace day after day, circling, retreating, returning, covering distances that sedentary commanders judged impossible. This was not just a cavalry force, it was a long-range, self-contained mobile weapon system. Around that core, Genghis Khan wrapped structure. The decimal organization he had used to tame the tribes was also a machine for coordinated violence. 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000 each, with designated leaders, each expected to obey orders even when far from the Khan's direct gaze. Promotions and demotions reinforced this. A commander who won battles and kept discipline might be advanced over men of higher birth. One who disobeyed signals or broke ranks in search of plunder could be executed, even if he was noble, even if he was related. Communication on the field relied on speed and clarity. Drums, flags, messengers on fast horses, sometimes burning torches at night, simple signals drilled into men who had practiced responding to them in hunting parties and training maneuvers long before they ever saw a foreign city wall. Units that had once been rival clans now learned to wheel as one, to open and close like a hand. Within that system, a set of preferred maneuvers emerged. The feigned retreat is the most famous. It sounds straightforward: pretend to flee, lure the enemy into disorder, then turn and attack. In reality, it requires iron discipline. Hundreds or thousands of riders need to seem panicked without actually being so, to remember exactly when and where they are meant to wheel around. Pursuing forces, convinced they are seeing victory, break their line, spread out, race ahead of their own infantry. Dust, noise, the intoxication of the chase do the rest. Then, at a prearranged signal, the Mongol fugitives pivot, or another force appears from the flank, and the hunters find themselves the hunted. Encirclement was another favourite. Scouts and advance guards would map the terrain, look for places where an enemy could be corralled. On the day of battle, multiple columns would approach from different directions, sometimes after marching around the enemy for days, cutting off foraging parties, probing for weak points. The aim was not always a dramatic clash in the centre. Often it was a slow tightening of the ring, arrows grinding away at cohesion, small units being shredded when they tried to break out, food and water sources denied until morale collapsed. All of this was supported by a relentless operational tempo. Genghis Khan's forces did not move like the seasonal armies of many agricultural states which formed, campaigned for a few months, then went home to harvest. Once a Mongol force was in motion, it could stay in motion, living off herds, supplemented by careful planning and supply arrangements. Columns could separate by hundreds of kilometers and still be part of one operation, converging on a target from different directions within days. This made their campaigns feel less like a series of set-piece battles and more like a weather system, hard to predict, hard to escape. But speed and maneuver are only part of the picture. The Mongol war machine also depended on knowing where to go and what would happen when they got there. Before major campaigns, Genghis Khan drew on a web of information. Steppe scouts were sent out months in advance, sometimes years, to learn routes, rivers, winter pastures that could support large numbers of horses. Traders who moved between Central Asian oases, Chinese border markets, Persian caravanserais, carried news whether they meant to or not. Some were quietly recruited, promised protection and profit in exchange for maps, gossip, lists of rivalries inside the target state. Translators and scribes captured in earlier wars became assets in later ones. A Turkic-speaking secretary taken in one campaign might be indispensable in the next, reading intercepted messages, explaining local customs, advising on which noble might be tempted to defect. Envoys were sent ahead not only to demand submission, but also to measure responses, to watch who whispered with whom in the receiving court, to identify factions that might be played against each other. Defectors, too, were both a product and a tool of Mongol power. Leaders of frontier garrisons, disgruntled princes, merchants nursing grievances, when they crossed over, they were often treated with deliberate generosity, at least at first. Their knowledge of passes, magazines, city politics could save weeks of guesswork. Of course, once they had served that purpose, their fates varied. As the Mongols moved off the open grasslands and into regions of walled cities and irrigated fields, another adaptation was needed. Steppe cavalry alone could not bring down stone. Here Genghis Khan showed a willingness to borrow ruthlessly. After the first contacts with the Jin and with the Tangut kingdom of Jishe, he began incorporating engineers and specialists from conquered peoples. Chinese artisans who knew how to build traction, trebuchets, dig mines under walls, construct siege towers, Muslim engineers from Central Asia who were skilled in heavier counterweight engines and in managing large-scale logistics, craftsmen who could organize labor to fill moats, build rams, fabricate ladders. Captured cities were sometimes spared wholesale destruction if their specialists agreed to serve. Siege trains began to travel with the army, carts loaded with components, artisans overseeing local conscription to move earth, cut timber, drag stones. In some campaigns, particularly later ones under his successors, this siege corps would be almost an army within the army, summoned to reduce fortifications that horse archers alone could never crack. Overlaying all of this was a deliberate use of fear. Genghis Khan did not simply rely on brute force and hope that stories would spread on their own. His envoys often carried a simple offer to cities and rulers: submit, hand over hostages and tribute, open your gates when we arrive, and you will be spared the worst. Resist, kill envoys, break oaths, and the response would be devastating. Accounts of entire populations killed, of towers built from skulls, of survivors driven into slavery, are preserved in both friendly and hostile sources. The exact numbers are almost certainly exaggerated. Medieval chroniclers were not statisticians. But the pattern is consistent. Places that resisted fiercely and then fell could expect harsh treatment. Places that surrendered early sometimes retained their local elites, kept their crafts, were slotted into the imperial system with relative care. The important thing is not to count the dead, but to understand the logic. Each destroyed city became a message to the next 10. Refugees fleeing down the road carried stories ahead of the armies, of horsemen who seemed to appear from nowhere, of engineers who turned walls into rubble, of a Khan whose word, for good or ill, tended to be kept. City councils and court factions far beyond the immediate frontiers began weighing their choices with those stories in mind. Tactics, intelligence, siegecraft, and terror were not separate tools. They reinforced one another. Information made speed more effective. Speed made encirclement easier. Encirclement, supported by siege engines, made resistance look futile. And the terrifying examples made the next potential target think twice before forcing the Mongols to prove the point again. By the time Genghis Khan turned his gaze south toward the Jin dynasty, the machine was ready. Archers, remounts, engineers, spies, and stories all aligned, pointing like an arrow toward the richest lands his people had ever seen. To understand what came next, it helps to know who was waiting on the other side of the steppe. South of the Mongol grasslands, across a belt of scrub and border forts, lay the Jin dynasty. They were Jurchen rulers who had ridden down from the forests of Manchuria a century earlier, conquered northern China, and then settled into the role of an established imperial power. They controlled rich river valleys, irrigated fields, ironworks, cities with paper money and bureaucracy, and tax records tallied on bamboo slips. From the Mongol point of view, the Jin was something else as well. They were overlords for decades. The Jin court had treated the Mongol tribes as peripheral dependents, sometimes allies, sometimes vassals, sometimes useful nuisances. They demanded tribute in horses and furs. They recognized certain steppe leaders as kings when it suited them, then withdrew support when it did not. Temujin's own father had dealt with Jin officials. Early in his career, Genghis himself had, at least nominally, accepted Jin supremacy. That kind of relationship might have been bearable when Mongol unity was fragile. Once the tribes were welded together and the war machine was humming, it became a provocation. There was also geography. The northern fringe of the Jin realm was not a neat wall. It was a zone of contact, pasture lands that Mongols wanted for grazing, frontier markets where they sold animals in exchange for grain and manufactured goods, valleys that funneled raiders toward deeper, richer targets. As Mongol power expanded, friction at this edge grew. Each border skirmish, each dispute over a frontier chieftain, pushed the two systems closer to collision. When Genghis Khan finally moved, he did not start by hurling his army against the biggest walls. He started by probing. Early campaigns in the 1210s tested Jin defences, raiding border towns, shattering field armies that tried to block the steppe. These expeditions taught the Mongols the layout of the frontier, where the fortresses sat, which rivers could be forded, which stretches of land could support tens of thousands of horses in winter. They also sent a message to other regional powers watching carefully from the sidelines. One of those powers was Xizya, the Tangut kingdom wedged between the Mongol steppe, the deserts of the northwest, and the Jin heartland. Exile was smaller than Jin, but still wealthy. It controlled oases, caravan routes, and irrigated lands along the Yellow River's upper reaches. Years earlier, Genghis had campaigned against it, forcing its rulers into a kind of uneasy submission. Now, as he turned toward Jin, that relationship became a lever. Sometimes Xizya was treated as an ally, providing troops, grain, or passage. Sometimes it was a hostage, threatened to devastate Tangut fields, and you could put pressure on Jin from an unexpected angle. At different moments, Genghis played them off each other, accepting tribute from one while striking the other, always with an eye toward keeping his own supply lines open and his enemies divided. Because once the Mongols stepped fully into Jin territory, the nature of war changed. On the open steppe, a campaign could be a moving thing, no fixed front, no long pauses. In northern China, there were cities, walls, granaries, river crossings. You could not simply ride through and call it victory. You had to take or neutralize the fortified points that controlled movement and food. This is where the earlier experiments with siegecraft began to harden into routine. In the First Jin War, Mongol columns fanned out, bypassing certain fortresses, isolating others, testing how long their own forces could remain in one region without stripping it bare. They learned to move in seasons that their enemies thought safe. Winter campaigns became common. Frozen rivers turned from barriers into highways. Snow-covered fields that looked dead to a sedentary commander still offered grazing under the crust for hardy steppe ponies. Supply was a constant question. Tens of thousands of horses could not live off captured granaries alone. Grass mattered as much as grain. The Mongols mapped winter pastures as carefully as they mapped city defences. Herds were rotated, not only within a single army, but across the wider steppe. Fresh remounts could be brought down, while tired animals were sent back north. This circulation allowed Genghis to keep pressure on the Jin over multiple years, without the usual agricultural pause. Within this framework, major milestones began to accumulate. Early on, Mongol forces smashed Jin field armies in the open, exploiting mobility and superior coordination. With the countryside exposed, they turned to key fortresses that anchored the defensive line. Some resisted for months. At certain cities, Chinese and Jurchen engineers on both sides waged a kind of technological duel. Traction trebuchets firing stones and incendiaries from within the walls, Mongol siege engines answering from outside, sappers digging, counter-sappers listening for the tap of picks underground. At places that fell, patterns emerged. Garrison troops were often killed outright, both as punishment and as a warning to the next city. Skilled artisans, scribes, engineers, and officials were singled out and spared, folded into the Mongol system. Sometimes ordinary townspeople were allowed to survive in large numbers, especially when a city surrendered early, or when its expertise, textile production, metalworking, paper-making was judged valuable. At other times, particularly when resistance was fierce or an oath had been broken, slaughter was wide and indiscriminate. Chroniclers speak of streets choked with bodies, of captives driven out in columns to be redistributed or sold. Numbers in these accounts vary wildly. Some later writers inflate them into the millions to emphasize horror or glory. Modern historians tend to be cautious, reading through exaggeration to see a grim but uneven reality. Some cities devastated, others scarred but functioning, many villages in between stripped by foraging armies regardless of which flag they claimed. The Jin sources, where they survive, often portray the Mongols as a calamity, an inhuman storm descending from the north to burn and plunder. Mongol and later Persian accounts, in contrast, frame the same events as the rightful punishment of an arrogant, decaying regime that had mistreated envoys and oppressed its subjects. Neither perspective is neutral. Both, however, agree on the scale of disruption. Fields went untilled, canals silted up, refugees crowded into any walled town that still seemed defensible, bringing disease and hunger with them. As years passed, Mongol adaptation deepened. They learned to keep city-surrounding blockades for longer rotating units in and out, so that besiegers did not exhaust local pasture. They experimented with multi-pronged offensives, one wing pinning a major Jin force in place, while another struck at its supply base, hundreds of kilometers away. They used local enemies of the Jin Khitan remnants, disaffected governors, as guides and auxiliary troops, promising them revenge or autonomy in exchange for opening gates. Step by step, the Jin position eroded. Important river crossings were taken. Regional capitals were isolated. At each stage, the Mongols had the option, and sometimes the temptation, to stop, accept tribute, and turn elsewhere. But the logic of their system, and of Genghis Khan's own ambition, pushed them onward. Every fortress captured meant more engineers, more scribes, more information about the next target. Every surrendered city became a potential base for the next campaign season. By the time the great Jin strongholds in the north were finally surrounded and forced to capitulate, the Mongols had done more than simply defeat another dynasty. They had learned through years of brutal trial and error how to conduct large-scale, multi-year campaigns in a densely settled agrarian world, and how to feed a steppe empire from the granaries of its neighbours. The cost to the people who lived there was staggering, even if exact numbers elude us. For those inside the walls, the coming of the Mongols might mean negotiated surrender and a new tax collector, or it might mean the end of their city. For the Mongols, it meant something else. Proof that the wealth of settled empires could be cracked open. That walls were not the end of mobility but a new arena in which to apply it. With northern China bleeding and the Jin on the defensive, Genghis Khan's gaze began to stretch farther along the trade routes that crossed his growing domain, toward the caravans rolling west, and the empire that would soon meet his envoys with suspicion rather than welcome. If you followed the caravan roads northwest from the Jin frontier, across the Gobi, through the string of oases that marked the edge of the deserts, you would eventually reach a different kind of world. Here, fields and orchards hugged rivers that lost themselves in sand. Cities rose not in endless chains like in China, but as islands of mud brick and baked tile. Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench. Their markets smelled of spices and wool grease and dusty books. Their walls protected not only granaries, but something else the steppe coveted more and more access. On maps drawn long after the fact, historians call this the Khwarezmian Empire. In Genghis Khan's day, it was the realm of Muhammad II, the Shah of Khwarezm, a ruler whose authority spread over much of Transoxiana, parts of Persia, and the lower reaches of the Amu Darya River. His lands sat astride the central arteries of the Silk Road. Caravans from China and the steppe passed through his cities to reach Persia, the Islamic heartlands, and, beyond them, the Mediterranean. From the Mongol point of view, Khwarezm was not just a neighbour. It was a gatekeeper. If its cities welcomed Mongol merchants, wealth could flow out, and manufactured goods could flow back. If its rulers turned hostile, they could choke trade, shelter enemies, or threaten the western flank of the empire. So when the Jin campaign opened China's northern granaries and workshops to the Mongols, Genghis's gaze naturally slid west along the same trading corridors that had carried ideas and fabrics for centuries. What he wanted, at least at first, was not conquest. It was recognition and safe passage. Sources from the time, especially Persian chronicles written under later Mongol rule, describe how Genghis sent envoys to the Shah, proposing friendship and trade. The story goes that the Khan addressed Muhammad II as an equal, the greatest of the Muslims speaking to the greatest of the Mongols. If this wording is accurate, it was carefully chosen. Steppe rulers in earlier generations had accepted subordinate titles from Chinese courts. Genghis did not. He was offering partnership, not vassalage. For a time, the Shah seems to have agreed, or at least pretended to. Caravans bearing Mongol goods made the trip west. Then something broke. The classic version of what happened next is simple, almost too neat. A large Mongol merchant caravan protected by an imperial paisa, an official tablet marking it as under Genghis Khan's protection, arrived at the frontier town of Otrar. The governor there, Inalchuk, allegedly suspected the merchants of spying, or simply coveted their goods. He arrested them, according to most accounts. He then had them killed and their wealth confiscated. News of this reached Genghis. He did not respond with immediate war. Instead, he sent a diplomatic mission to the Shah himself, demanding redress and punishment for the rogue governor. What happened at this embassy is murkier. Some sources claim that Muhammad II, angry at the implication that he did not control his own officials, executed the lead envoy and humiliated the others, reportedly shaving or burning their beards, a grave insult. Other accounts suggest he killed some but not all of them, or that the ambassador from the Muslim world serving Genghis was singled out. The details tangle and contradict each other, shaped by later politics and the desire to cast blame. What does seem consistent is this: Mongol envoys died at Khwarezmian hands, and their protection was ignored. On the steppe, that was more than a breach of protocol. Envoys were the threads that held together a world of fragile alliances, hostage exchanges, and tribute arrangements. Killing them was like cutting the ropes on a suspension bridge and then acting surprised when it collapsed. For Genghis Khan, the caravan and embassy incidents crystallized several things at once. There was security. If Khwarezmian officials could seize Mongol merchants on the frontier and face no consequences, what would stop them from raiding lightly defended pastures or harbouring steppe enemies? There was prestige. A Khan who let an insult to his envoys pass would look weak, not only abroad but at home, where rival lineages were always watching for signs of aging or hesitation. There was trade by this point. The Mongol Empire was not just a machine for extracting tribute in horses and women. It had begun to plug itself into wider commercial networks. Silk, medicine, paper, metalwork, all of these flowed most efficiently along safe, predictable routes. A hostile Khwarezm could turn the western half of the Silk Road into a gauntlet, and there was deterrence. Genghis had spent decades cultivating a reputation. Those who submitted early were rewarded. Those who resisted or broke oaths were annihilated. If a major ruler could flout that pattern without consequence, the whole logic of Mongol expansion would start to unravel. So he chose to make an example, not with a raid, but with something unprecedented in his career: a full-scale coordinated invasion of a distant, populous empire that had not yet raised a sword against him in open battle. Modern readers sometimes imagine a single Mongol horde rolling west, like a storm cloud. In reality, what Genghis planned was more intricate. Multiple armies would move along different routes. One would advance down from the northeast, crossing the Sir Daria and feeling out the defences of frontier cities. Another would push through the desert and mountain passes around the Aral Sea, aiming to appear where the Shah least expected them. A third, smaller force would strike southward toward the Persian plateau, threatening the rear of the Khwarezmian domains. There are even traditions suggesting that Genghis sent detachments on wide flanking rides across the steppe frontier to sow confusion about his true line of advance. All of this required timing, communication, and trust in subordinates at a scale that earlier steppe confederations simply had not attempted. It also required confidence that once Khwarezmian field armies were shattered, Mongol forces could do in Central Asia what they had just learned to do in northern China: besiege and take cities. The war that followed would test that confidence to its limit. It would see Bukhara and Samarkand surrounded, their defenders facing a kind of warfare few in that region had ever experienced. It would push Mongol columns deep into unfamiliar landscapes of irrigated fields and mountain strongholds. It would send survivors, refugees, defeated princes, ambitious generals, fleeing westward, carrying news of the horsemen with them, until kingdoms on the far side of Eurasia began to whisper the name Mongol, with a mixture of disbelief and dread. Looking back, it is tempting to draw a straight line. One governor's greed, one ruler's wounded pride, one steppe empire's harsh code of honor, and suddenly the Silk Road is on fire. Reality was more layered. Khwarezmian politics were already unstable. Genghis was already seeking new outlets for his expanding power. Trade, faith, fear, and ambition were already braided tight across the heart of Asia. But the caravan at Otrar, the slain envoys, the refusal to back down, these were the sparks that ignited the tangle. In a world where goods and messages moved faster than ever before, misunderstandings did not stay local. They propagated. A misread intention in a border town could, under the right conditions, become a cascading series of reprisals and mobilizations that redrew the map. By the time Mongol vanguards rode up to the walls of Bukhara and Samarkand, the choice to answer insult with annihilation had already turned a trade dispute into something else entirely. A war that would not only erase a dynasty, but permanently alter the rhythms of life along the Silk Road. When Mongol riders first appeared outside a major city, they did not usually begin by charging the walls. They began by watching. Scouts ranged around the perimeter, counting towers, measuring the depth of moats, noting where irrigation canals could be cut or diverted. They captured peasants working the fields, questioned them about garrisons and grain stores, then released some to carry messages back inside. The Mongols wanted to know how long a city could hold out, how divided its leadership was, whether commanders trusted each other or secretly hated one another. And then came the offer. Submit, open the gates, hand over the garrison and the treasury, and you would be spared. Local elites might keep their positions under Mongol oversight. Religious endowments could continue, markets could reopen under new rules. Resist, however, and the city was promised ruin, not only as punishment, but as a lesson to the next city down the road. This was not just bluster, it was a system. By the time Genghis turned west, the Mongols had already learned in northern China that walls were not just psychological barriers. They required technology, siege towers, rams, stone throwers, sappers with picks and shovels. The steppe did not naturally produce these things, but conquered states did. Chinese artisans, captured during earlier campaigns, travelled with the Mongol armies. So did Muslim engineers who had once served in frontier garrisons. They brought with them knowledge of traction trebuchets, counterweight catapults, siege crossbows, mining techniques. In Mongol service, these specialists were not simply tolerated. They were protected as valuable property of the Khan. When a city refused to submit, Genghis did not improvise. He convened these people. They advised on where to place engines, how to angle fire to stress specific sections of wall, how to undermine foundations silently at night. Siege warfare, under Mongol direction, became a grim kind of joint venture between nomad command and sedentary expertise. Bukhara was one of the first great tests of this method in Central Asia. The Shah's field army had already been drawn away, lured and shattered in a series of maneuvers that left the city exposed. When Mongol banners appeared on the horizon, Bukhara's defenders faced not only cavalry, but a force that knew how to operate around walls. Accounts written later, especially by chroniclers serving under Mongol rule, describe the fall of Bukhara with a tone of dark theatre. The city's outer defences, undermanned, collapsed quickly under attack. Some narrate that the remaining troops retreated to the citadel, leaving much of the population effectively unprotected. According to one famous passage, Genghis entered the Friday mosque, mounted the pulpit, and declared that he was the scourge of God come because the people had sinned. Did he really say those exact words? It is hard to know. Pious embellishment and retrospective moralizing colour these sources. but the essentials are plausible. The Mongols made a point of framing conquest as both military fact and moral judgment. Resistance was not just foolish, it was blameworthy. Submission, in turn, could be recast as a kind of repentance. What followed was ugly, but also calculated. Men of fighting age were often killed or enslaved. Some inhabitants were marked and set aside for later tasks. Engineers and artisans, metalworkers, carpenters, scribes were singled out and protected. Young women and children were divided among the victors. Wealth was seized, fire was used, but not always indiscriminately. Buildings of particular use, granaries, workshops, religious institutions that might stabilize the city under new rulers, might be spared. From Bukhara, the Mongols moved on Samarkand, a richer and more heavily fortified prize. Here the Shah had concentrated troops and trusted that numbers and walls would hold. They did not. Mongol forces approached from multiple directions, using feints and sudden appearances to convince the defenders that they were surrounded by more men than actually stood outside their gates. Siege engines assembled from local timber began pounding at vulnerable sectors. Sappers worked to collapse towers. Inside, morale frayed. Sources from both sides emphasize a key moment when contingents of war elephants deployed by the defenders panicked under missile fire and wreaked havoc among their own lines. Whether or not the details are precise, the pattern is clear. Once the outer defensive ring faltered, Samarkand's elite units broke. Some commanders fled, others negotiated private surrenders. Again the Mongol method appears. Promise life to those who lay down arms quickly, then use them. Prisoners were sometimes driven ahead as human shields in subsequent assaults, or forced to fill moats and level ditches, turning the countryside into a kind of expendable engineering corps. Skilled individuals were sorted out, recorded, and sent east or west where they were needed. You could be a glassmaker from Samarkand and find yourself, years later, working in a workshop on the borders of China, your craft now part of the imperial machine that had destroyed your city. Much of what we think we know about the massacres at Bukhara, Samarkand, and other cities comes from writers who loved large numbers. Hundreds of thousands slain, entire populations erased. Modern historians, looking at demographic and logistical realities, tend to be more cautious. Total annihilation of every inhabitant was probably rare. It was also counterproductive if the Khan wanted tax-paying farmers on the land, artisans at their benches, and administrators who understood local languages and customs. The Mongols needed the productivity of conquered regions. Killing everyone would leave them ruling ash and fields gone to weed. But within this constraint, terror was not an accident. It was a policy. When a city resisted after clear warnings, the punishment could be spectacular. Large segments of the population might be executed or enslaved, and the news of it deliberately spread. Refugees were allowed to flee in specific directions, carrying stories with them. Travellers along the Silk Road would pass through towns half empty, hear of neighbours who had been sold deep into the steppe, see the skull mounds that some sources describe, whether or not they were as large as the chronicles claimed. At the same time, those who surrendered early were treated very differently. Local bureaucrats who could keep tax records, religious scholars who could help legitimize new rulers, and merchants who knew caravan routes were often left in place, albeit under Mongol oversight and tribute demands. Artisans were not just spared, they were moved and concentrated to serve imperial needs. This dual approach, ruthless toward defiance, pragmatic toward utility, gave Genghis a flexible tool for ruling lands fundamentally unlike the open steppe. Word of this contrast travelled almost as fast as the armies themselves. For rulers and city councils across the region, calculations changed. You could fight and hope that Allah, or fortune or the courage of your men would miraculously hold against an enemy who combined mobility with siegecraft. Or you could open the gates, hand over hostages, agree to taxes, and trust that submission now might mean survival for your family and your trade. Some chose to stand and were ground down. Others, watching the pattern, chose another path, sending envoys out before the first Mongol horses came into view. In the space of just a few campaigns, the reputation forged at Bukhara and Samarkand had done something that normally took generations. It rewrote the mental map of an entire region. Between the walls of every city, behind every council table, men now planned with the Mongols in mind, not as distant raiders, but as a power capable of deciding who would live, who would die, and who would carry their skills into a new, enforced order stretching from China's fields to the gardens of Central Asia. For the Shah of Khwarezm, there would be no negotiated surrender, no careful sorting of useful skills from condemned lives. When his empire cracked under the weight of Mongol invasion, he chose flight over compromise. Westward, always westward, across deserts and mountains, pursued by an enemy he could not defeat and could not shake. Genghis did not chase him in person, he delegated. Two of his most capable generals, Jibi and Subutai, received a different kind of order. Not simply revenge, though that was part of it. Not simple pursuit, though they were expected to harry the Shah until he died. Their instructions were more open-ended. Go, follow him. Break what resists you. Learn everything. In later chronicles, this campaign reads like a long, looping arrow. A single Mongol force sweeping from Central Asia into Iran, then turning through the Caucasus, then out onto the plains beyond the Black Sea. But on the ground, for the people who felt its passing, it was something more unsettling, a moving question. Where does the world end? As JB and Subutai rode, the Khwarezmian realm fell into pieces behind them. Governors became independent warlords. City garrisons turned into private armies. Old rivalries that had been kept in check by the Shah's authority now flared into open conflict. The empire that had once seemed solid enough to defy the Mongols became, in a few seasons, a scatter of embers blowing on the wind. The Mongols observed this closely. They saw that when a central ruler fled, loyalty did not automatically flow to a new throne. It fragmented. Local elites bargained, defected, or simply barricaded themselves and hoped to be ignored. Genghis would remember this lesson. So would his heirs. Meanwhile, the pursuit continued. Jabe and Subutai drove their men in the same pattern they had used elsewhere. Fast, light, leaving little behind but rumours and smoke. They gathered guides, often at spear point, caravan leaders, local hunters, escaped slaves, anyone who knew a path, a ford, a hidden pass. These men might be promised reward or simply dragged along. Some perished, some adapted and survived, becoming part of the moving network of knowledge that travelled with the Mongol army. Captives were interrogated with the same disciplined curiosity the Mongols brought to siegecraft. Which river led where? Which town lay beyond the next ridge? Who ruled it? What language he spoke? What enemies he feared? The answers were not written on parchment. They were fixed in memory, repeated and discussed around night fires, tested when sunrise came and the column moved on. The Shah himself died far from home, reportedly sick and exhausted, on an island in the Caspian Sea. The man whose merchants had once dominated routes from India to the steppe ended his life as a fugitive, surrounded by a shrinking circle of loyalists. Jibei and Subutai did not stop. Freed from the need to catch a specific person, their mission became something rarer in medieval warfare, a reconnaissance in force on a continental scale. They pushed into the Caucasus, a region that had long been a crossroads between steppe nomads, mountain principalities, and the great empires to the south. Here they met new kinds of opponents: Georgian and Armenian forces, mountain peoples who knew every gorge and cliff. Some battles went quickly, some did not. In one famous episode, a coalition of mountain tribes agreed to peace talks, then ambushed a Mongol escort. The reprisal was brutal, but the lesson cut both ways. The Mongols learned that not every negotiated submission would hold. They also learned which passes were deadly, which valleys were traps, which local powers might be turned against their neighbours. Those who survived capture found themselves serving as unwilling cartographers. A noble might be spared because he could point with shaking hand to the roads leading towards silk-producing districts. A merchant might live because he could list the cities that ringed the Black Sea. Geography in Mongol hands became less a set of lines on a map and more a web of obligations, fears, and rivalries mapped onto physical space. From the Caucasus, Gibi and Subutai emerged onto new grasslands. Ahead lay the domains of the Cumans and Kipchaks, Turkic steppe peoples whose horses grazed the plains north of the Black Sea. To the west, beyond them, stood the principalities of the Rus, a patchwork of cities like Kiev and Vladimir, linked by rivers, Christian churches, and long-standing trade with Byzantium and the Baltic. For the Mongols, this was not yet a target list. It was an unknown frontier. They probed it the way they probed everything else, with movement. Some Cuman chiefs, understanding steppe politics, tried to recruit the Mongols as allies against their rivals. Others fled to the Rus lands, urging the princes there to join them against this new, relentless cavalry. Motives tangled. Old grudges against neighbouring cities competed with fear of the strangers from the east. In 1223, these threads pulled together at the Kulka River. On one side, a coalition of Rus princes and Cuman allies. On the other, a Mongol force that was, in absolute numbers, not overwhelming by Eurasian standards, but coordinated, disciplined, and directed by commanders who had spent years learning to read both terrain and human behaviour. The battle did not become a neat heroic tableau. It unfolded as so many Mongol engagements did, with patience, deception, and a sudden turn. For days, Jabi and Subutai drew the combined Rus force after them, feigning a retreat that played into the confidence of princes unused to this kind of elastic warfare. When the coalition's formation had stretched and frayed, the Mongols reversed course, concentrating their strength against isolated segments. The result was catastrophic for the Rus' side. Some princes were killed on the field. Others were reportedly captured and executed later, their supposed immunity as Christian rulers meaning nothing to men who measured value in obedience, not sacral titles. The Mongols, having proven that they could strike deep into an unfamiliar region, did something unexpected. They left. There was no immediate follow-up conquest of the Rus lands, no systematic siege of Kiev, no attempt to hold permanent territory beyond scattered alliances and tribute agreements. Gibi and Subutai had never been sent to plant firm flags. They had been sent to sea. They rode back east with more than loot. They carried mental maps of rivers and plains, lists of cities and their quarrels, impressions of how quickly coalitions formed and how easily they broke under pressure. They returned with a tested sense of the Western Steppes' vulnerabilities: divided princes, rival clans, fortresses poorly adapted to mobile war. Behind them, the lands they had touched settled uneasily. In the Rus chronicles, the Mongols appeared as a terrifying anomaly, a scourge from beyond the known horizon. Among the Cumans and in the Caucasus, stories spread of riders who could not be caught, who knew how to disappear into distance and then reappear where least expected. Rumours reached farther still, along trade routes into Hungary, Byzantium, even the Latin kingdoms. Tales of an Eastern people, fierce but still indistinct. Some confused them with old Christian legends of a powerful king in the east. Others dismissed them as another wave of nomads, dangerous but transient. The storm had brushed the edge of Europe's world and receded. For now, in Karakoram and across the steppe, the information gathered on that long, looping ride did not fade. It settled into memory, into council discussions, into the quiet, accumulating sense that beyond the familiar horizons there were more cities, more pastures, more fractured realms that could be turned against themselves. The West, meanwhile, tried to sleep again under the thin comfort of distance, aware that something had moved at the edge of the map, but not yet understanding that the footsteps they had heard were only the scouts of a much larger army that had not yet begun to march. When that larger army did move, and when cities stopped being rumours on the edge of a map and started being places that sent messengers and tribute, another problem surfaced. Conquest was only the first act. You can burn a town in an afternoon. You can't milk taxes from ashes. You can't recruit engineers from a slaughtered population. You can terrorize your way into a capital, but fear alone won't tell you how much grain is in its storehouses, or which merchant is quietly important enough that killing him would crash a region's trade. Genghis understood this, or learned it very quickly. As his empire spread from Manchuria to the edges of the Caspian, he began building something that had never existed on the steppe before, a system for ruling strangers at scale. He started from what he knew. On the steppe, authority had always flowed through people, not institutions. You obeyed your clan head, your war leader, your patron. Agreements were sealed with shared hardship, feasts and oaths, not with stamped documents. Genghis didn't erase this pattern, he extended it. Every conquered region was placed under the authority of someone who would answer directly to him, a prince of his family, a trusted general, or a senior Noyan. These men were given wide powers, military command, judicial authority, control over tax collection, but also clear responsibilities. They were expected to keep order, send revenue, and above all remain loyal. Beneath them, existing local elites were not always swept away. Often they were folded into the new structure. A Chinese official who knew how to keep irrigation canals functioning might be left in his post, now answering to a Mongol governor instead of a Jin emperor. A Muslim tax collector in Central Asia might find that his job continued, except that a share of the revenue now flowed east toward the steppe. In some cases, city councils and guild leaders were told, quietly but firmly, that their privileges would continue as long as they provided what was asked: supplies, information, obedience. Delegated authority became a web. At council, Genghis would apportion regions as if they were herds, each entrusted to a guardian. But he also began something more impersonal, something closer to bureaucracy. To tax you need to count in conquered China, in Transoxiana, in the lands of the Uyghurs and beyond. Mongol officials organized censuses. People were listed not only as warriors, but as households, producers, taxable units. Craftsmen were registered by trade, entire populations could be reassigned on the basis of these records, artisans moved to new cities, farmers clustered where irrigation could be restored, siege engineers gathered into imperial service. The tribute systems that emerged were varied. Some regions paid in silver, others in grain, textiles or livestock. Some cities negotiated fixed annual assessments. Others were simply told to provide what the local governor demanded. But everywhere, the logic was the same. Transform the raw chaos of conquest into predictable flows of resources. To make those flows possible, Genghis needed stability. And here, another choice stands out. He did not try to impose a single faith. The Mongol elite held to their own steppe practices, sky veneration, ancestor rituals, shamans, but in the cities they ruled, they treated religion less as truth to be enforced and more as a tool to be managed. Buddhist monasteries in northern China, Muslim mosques in Bukhara and Samarkand, Christian churches among the Nestorian communities, all could continue as long as they did not shelter rebellion. In some places, religious leaders were granted tax exemptions or legal protections. A respected imam or abbot could act as an intermediary, calming a frightened population, urging them to pay what was demanded instead of risking annihilation. In other cases, priests and monks were required to pray for the Khan's health, to mention his name in their rituals, folding Mongol rule into the sacred rhythm of daily life. Toleration here was not modern pluralism, it was pragmatic. Temples might be spared while neighbourhoods burned. A city that surrendered quickly could keep its clergy and shrines. One that resisted and then fell might see its sacred sites stripped, its holy men killed or enslaved. The pattern was not always consistent, but from the perspective of most subjects, one thing became clear. Public obedience to Mongol rule and a willingness to pay taxes were more important than which god you invoked at dawn. As these arrangements settled, trade began to revive and then expand. The Mongols had grown up in a world where caravans meant opportunity. Silk, spices, furs, ceramics, slaves, horses, all these had travelled across the steppe in smaller quantities long before Genghis was born. What changed under his rule was the scale and security of those movements. Bandits, small warlords and toll-collecting petty princes had been the constant hazard of overland trade. A caravan moving from northern China to Persia might pass through half a dozen political zones, each demanding fees or threatening violence. After Mongol conquest, large stretches of that route now lay under a single, terrifyingly effective authority. Roads were not paved, but they were patrolled. A merchant under Mongol protection could cross deserts and mountains knowing that, if he carried the right seals and paid the agreed taxes, local governors were supposed to help him, not rob him. In practice there were abuses, but compared to the fractured landscape that had existed before, the Pax Mongolica that began under Genghis and deepened under his heirs did something unusual. It made long-distance travel slightly less suicidal. To coordinate all of this, the governors, the tribute, the troop movements, the trade, Genghis leaned on one of the most remarkable innovations of his empire, the yam. Imagine a chain of relay stations stretching across thousands of kilometers. Every day, fresh horses waited at designated posts. Riders carried small tablets or paisi, tokens showing they were on official business. With these they could demand mounts, food, shelter. A message leaving Karakorum could leap from station to station, trading exhausted horses for rested ones, moving relentlessly across the steppe and mountains toward a frontier city. The yam was not just a mail system, it was a nervous system. News of a rebellion could reach the Khan far faster than any rebellious governor could hope to move his own troops. Orders for reinforcements, changes in tax policy, instructions for a newly conquered region, all could move with a speed that surprised settled societies used to slower, more local politics. For merchants granted access to parts of the yam, it meant that information about prices, demand and danger could circulate more widely, knitting markets together. Yet beneath this growing order, the memory of how it had been created never vanished. Entire populations had been uprooted to feed the machine. Towns that resisted had seen their walls torn down. Their inhabitants counted not for taxation, but for execution, with only a fraction spared as slaves or deported artisans. In some regions, the fields recovered quickly. In others, irrigation systems lay broken for years, and survivors worked under new masters, haunted by what had happened when the Mongol banners first appeared on the horizon. For many merchants, scribes, and craftsmen, Mongol rule offered unexpected opportunities, patronage, safer roads, a chance to sell goods in markets they had only heard of. For many peasants and townspeople, it meant heavier exactions, foreign overseers, and the knowledge that the law they now lived under had been written in another language, born from a world of tents and horse herds far away. Genghis's empire of riders had learned to sit in cities, to count and tax and correspond. It had discovered that the same discipline that broke armies could also make ledgers add up and caravans arrive on time. But at its core it was still what it had always been, a network of loyalties and fears radiating outward from a single person. And that raised a question the Yam could not answer, the census could not solve. What happens to an empire built so tightly around one man when his horse finally goes riderless? For Genghis, that question was not abstract. He had a family, he had sons, he had grandsons by the time his western campaigns were raging. And on the steppe, family was not a sentimental category. It was the hard currency of politics. His chief wife, Bertie, had been promised to him when they were children, taken from him when he was still Temujin, the desperate fugitive, and rescued at enormous risk. That story lived in the memory of the camp. It bound her to him in legend as much as in law. Through Bert came the sons who mattered most for succession: Yoki, Chagatai, Ogedei, and Tolui. Each of them carried not just his blood, but claims on the future herds, the conquered cities, the right to sit where he sat. At least that was the theory. The problem began with the firstborn. When Berta was kidnapped by the Merkids, and then recovered months later, the child she carried, Jochi, came into the world under a shadow. The official story, the one you were expected to repeat, was simple. A child born to the lawful wife belonged to the husband. Genghis accepted Jochi publicly, raised him, trusted him with serious commands. But people talk. Rivals whisper. Chroniclers writing decades later preserve the rumour that, in private, doubts remained. Some sources describe Chagatai, hot-tempered and rigid, throwing the insult in Jochi's face during an argument. Others hint that Genghis himself once used the phrase, "Jochi is not my son," in anger, though whether that reflects reality or later gossip is impossible to know. What we can say is that the question of paternity, even if never definitively answered, had political weight. On the steppe, where loyalty travelled through the veins as much as through treaties, any uncertainty in bloodline was a crack in the foundation. Jochi's followers in the west, his own sons and commanders, would one day insist on their seniority as descendants of the eldest son. Others, loyal to Chagatai or Ogedei, could quietly reply that eldest did not necessarily mean legitimate. Genghis could not erase these tensions, but he tried to manage them. As his empire expanded, he began to distribute lands and peoples among his sons as appanages, hereditary domains from which they would draw tribute, recruits, and prestige. Jochi's sphere lay in the far west, the steppes north of the Caspian, the future base of what later generations would call the Golden Horde. Chagatai's claim centred on the central steppe and Transoxiana. Ogedei's lands clustered closer to the Mongol heartland. Tolui, the youngest, held much of the original Mongol homeland and large swaths of northern China. On paper, this system made sense. It rewarded the princes who had fought beside him. It placed trusted family members over crucial frontiers. It anchored each son's ambitions to a specific region instead of letting them all claw over the same pastures. But appanages work like fault lines. Each domain grew its own court, its own coterie of generals, its own networks of marriage alliances with local elites. Over time, loyalties tilted sideways. A Noyan in Transoxiana might care less about the distant Khan and more about the Chagatai prince, whose favour determined his grazing rights. A governor in the western steppes might listen more closely to Jochi's sons than to orders coming from far-off Karakoram. Genghis seems to have sensed the danger. His answer was to keep the final decision about succession in his own hands. Later sources agree that he convened a great council, a Kurultai, to address the question. The princes had different reputations by then. Chagatai, the second son, was brave, uncompromising, a fierce upholder of steppe custom. He was also known for a temper that could turn arguments into blood feuds. Putting the whole empire under a man like that risked constant internal war. Tului, the youngest, was perhaps the most militarily accomplished, the hammer Genghis trusted for some of his harshest campaigns. His role as guardian of the homeland and of the main portion of the imperial army made him powerful, but also, in a sense, indispensable where he was. Moving him into the supreme position would have left a vacuum at the core. Ogedei, the third son, was different. Chroniclers describe him as sociable, generous, sometimes indulgent. Not the most brilliant tactician, not the harshest disciplinarian. But he had a gift for compromise, for smoothing quarrels, for listening. In a world where the empire's biggest danger was not an external enemy, but internal collision between ambitious branches of the same family, those qualities mattered. According to the traditional narrative, Genghis chose Ogedei as his successor, precisely because he was the one most likely to be accepted by his brothers, and least likely to rip the structure apart through sheer will. The decision did not erase rivalry, it contained it. Even so, the choice shows the collision between two scales of politics. On the older clan-level steppe, succession could be fluid. A strong man was acclaimed by warriors, weak or unpopular heirs could be bypassed. Disputes, when they stayed within a tribe, might result in a split camp, a bad season, a few dozen dead. At imperial scale, with millions of subjects and armies operating on multiple continents, the same patterns became catastrophes waiting to happen. A disputed Kurultai in Karakoram did not just mean hurt feelings. It meant governors in Persia hesitating to remit taxes until they knew whom to obey. It meant generals on the Volga wondering whether they should turn their horses east, toward brothers, instead of west, toward new conquests. Genghis tried to stitch steppe tradition and imperial reality together. He kept the Kurultai as the formal mechanism of legitimacy. A Khan was still raised up on a felt carpet by the hands of nobles. At the same time, he made it clear that his own designation of Ogedei should guide that choice, hoping to lock in continuity beyond his death. He divided lands among his sons, but insisted that ultimate sovereignty, the right to summon armies from any appanage, rested with the great Khan. He trusted Tolui with the homeland's core resources, but did not name him heir. He allowed Chagatai significant authority in Central Asia, but kept him out of the top position where his rigidity might fracture the whole. These were careful maneuvers, but they did not change the underlying truth. The empire was still, at its heart, a web of personal loyalties tied to one man's story, the outcast boy who had seized the sky's favour. When that story ended, when the man at the centre finally disappeared from the campfire circle, the family he had raised and the world he had conquered would have to decide whether his arrangements were strong enough to survive without him. That decision came sooner than many expected, on a campaign that would be his last. The last campaign began, in a sense, as housekeeping. In the west, cities burned, caravans were redirected, new governors bowed toward the steppe. The empire looked immense, almost complete, but to the southwest of the Mongol homeland sat a smaller, stubborn kingdom Genghis knew too well, Sha. He had fought them before. They had been early targets in his rise, a rich, semi-desert state straddling key trade routes between China and Central Asia. Their rulers had paid him tribute, sent troops, promised loyalty. Then, during his Great Western War against Khwarezm, when he demanded their full military support for the long campaign, they hesitated, manoeuvred, tried to preserve their own advantage. To Genghis, That was not clever neutrality. It was betrayal. The Mongol political imagination had room for many things. You could be an enemy and fight to the death. You could submit and be left in place as a vassal. You could even defect from a former master and be welcomed with honours if you came at the right time. What you could not safely be was an ally who failed to show up when called. Xia had, in Mongol eyes, broken the pact. They had accepted protection, then tried to sit out the storm. So when the Western War wound down, and Genghis turned his gaze back toward the heartlands, that unfinished account was waiting for him, like a debt recorded in the ledgers of the sky. He was not a young man anymore. By most estimates he was in his mid-60s, an advanced age on the steppe. His body had taken the punishment of decades in the saddle, winter campaigns, wounds and falls that would have crippled lesser men. But he still chose to ride. The campaign against Xixia was not a glorious sweep into unknown lands. It was grinding, methodical, punitive. Mongol forces crossed into their territory with the confidence of veterans who had already broken larger empires. Cities were encircled, irrigation systems wrecked, farmland trampled. Chroniclers describe this war in harsh terms, even by Mongol standards, not merely a conquest, but a deliberate unmaking. Part of that was strategic. Xixia's location made it a potential staging ground for any future enemy from the southwest. Leaving them half subdued was like leaving a knife buried hilt deep in your own flank. But part of it was message. By this time, the Mongol name travelled ahead of Mongol horses. Rulers from the Caucasus to northern China were calculating how far they could bend without breaking. The destruction of Xixia was a demonstration lesson. Those who had once submitted and then wavered would not be given a second chance. In that sense, the old outcast from the Onon River was still doing what he had always done, turning personal grievance and political necessity into the same campaign. Somewhere during this war he died. The where and the how are the places where the story frays. Later sources offer competing versions. One tradition says he fell from his horse during a hunt or in the chaos of campaign and never fully recovered from his injuries. Another claims he was wounded in battle against the Xixia, struck down in the thick of fighting like any other warrior. Still others, written long after his lifetime and shaped by legend, suggest more dramatic scenes, assassination, illness brought on by rage, even fantastical tales involving captive princesses. Modern historians tend to treat the more lurid accounts with caution. The fragmentary nature of the sources, their distance from the events, and their clear interest in telling a memorable story over a strictly factual one all make certainty difficult. What we can say is that he seems to have been ailing during the campaign, and that his death was connected in time to the final subjugation of Xixia, around 1227. The circumstances are blurred, the reaction is not. News of the Khan's death did not spread like a shockwave. It was muffled, contained, deliberately slowed. According to many accounts, the Mongol leadership kept his death secret until the campaign was fully concluded. Armies still needed to move, sieges needed to end, oaths needed to be exacted. An announcement at the wrong moment might have turned every half-subdued city into a desperate holdout, every vassal into a gambler thinking the empire's will had died with the man. So the machinery kept moving while behind its clatter a different kind of operation began. His body, or at least the idea of his body, had to go home. Here again, the sources give us more story than certainty. Some say the corpse was carried back toward Mongolia under heavy guard, surrounded by absolute secrecy. Others hint that extraordinary measures were taken to conceal the route, to prevent any shrine or pilgrimage site from forming along the way. The most famous tradition insists that when he was finally buried, the attendants killed anyone who happened upon the funeral procession, then themselves were killed in turn, so that no living person could point to the grave. Another adds that a river was diverted to flow over the site. These details are dramatic and probably embroidered over time, but they fit a consistent pattern, an insistence on anonymity. What seems likely is that his burial place was indeed left unmarked, its location known only to a very small circle that did not preserve it in writing. No monumental tomb, no pyramid on the plain, just earth returning to earth somewhere in the broad, rolling lands that had shaped him. An empire of stone and cities could afford marble memorials. A conqueror who still thought in steppe terms could imagine a different kind of immortality, not a single visible grave, but a world rearranged. Strategically, his death did not bring that world crashing down. This was not an empire that vanished the moment its founder exhaled for the last time. In the years before Shishir, he had been careful, by steppe standards, even unusually careful, to weave continuity into the system. The Kurultai mechanism remained. His designation of Ogedei was known among the leading princes and commanders. Tului stood ready to act as caretaker in the homeland until a formal election could be held. The law code he had promulgated, the yasa, and the administrative practices he had encouraged gave generals and governors a set of shared expectations. Tributes still flowed along routes mapped and enforced by years of campaigning. When his body, whether in actuality or symbolically, made its quiet way back toward Mongolia, orders still went out in his name. Cities in Xixia still fell, envoys still rode with seals that bore his authority, even as that authority was already passing into the hands of his heirs. In the short term, the message was clear. The sky's favour did not die with the old Khan. It flowed through his chosen successor and through the institutions he had left behind. Only later, when news of his death became known more widely, did the deeper questions return. How long could a web of personal loyalties survive without the person at its centre? How would appanage princes, emboldened by distance and by their own ambitions, respond when the felt carpet was rolled out for a new great Khan? Those are questions for the next part of the story. For now, the picture is simple and strange. A vast empire still in motion. A last campaign completed against a kingdom that had misread the meaning of obedience. Somewhere on the steppe, an unmarked grave, and above it all an inheritance that was no longer one man's will, but a momentum that would carry his descendants farther than he had ever ridden. The conquests would not pause. They would intensify. With Genghis Khan gone from the campfires but present in every command, the age of his legacy was about to begin. The first answer to those questions came with the familiar sound, hooves. When the Kurultai finally convened and confirmed Ogedei as Great Khan, the choice fit the logic of the system his father had built. Ogedei was not the eldest surviving son, not the fiercest warrior, not the most austere. What he was, according to several sources, was even-tempered, pragmatic, and capable of balancing competing factions without immediately trying to annihilate them. For an empire stretched from the forests of Siberia to the edges of Iran, that quality mattered more than being the best archer on the field. Under Ogedei, the machine did not slow. It standardized. New campaigns pushed deeper into northern China against the Jin until their dynasty, already weakened by years of pressure, collapsed altogether. South of them, the rich, humid lands of the Song began to feel the weight of reconnaissance raids and diplomatic probes. To the west, Mongol forces regrouped and prepared for a new thrust across the steppe and into the settled world of Eastern Europe. Expansion, under Ogedei, was not just glory hunting. It was problem-solving. The empire paid its warriors in shares of booty and in rights to pasture and tax revenue. Generals expected rewards. Princes expected appanages. Newly conquered lands fed older promises. As long as new territory kept coming in, The system could distribute grain, silver, silk, and grazing rights down the hierarchy. Stop expanding, and suddenly you had a different conversation. Not what will we seize next, but who will give something up? The easiest way to avoid that was to keep the frontiers moving. That is part of why, even after the man from the Onon River died, his empire kept lunging outward. Not just because his sons wanted to honour his memory, or because they loved battle, but because the internal logic of what he had built pushed them in that direction. Still, no system based on personal bonds and shared war spoils can grow forever without changing. As Mongol armies overran new regions, they began to crystallize into something like separate worlds under a shared sky. In the west, the lands taken by Joshi's line would become known later as the Golden Horde, ruling over the steppes of Russia and the trading cities along the Volga and the Black Sea. In Persia and the Middle East, another branch of the family would form the Ilkhanate, a Mongol-ruled state sitting atop old Persian bureaucratic traditions and Islamic societies. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate emerged, bridging nomadic pastures and oasis towns. In China, the line of Tolui and Kublai would eventually transform into the Yuan dynasty, presenting themselves not as foreign raiders but as emperors in the Chinese mould. At first, all these realms recognized the authority of a single great Khan in Mongolia, at least in theory. Envoys rode back and forth, tributes were sent, formalities observed. Decisions about major campaigns were supposed to funnel through the imperial centre. Over time, that unity thinned, distance mattered. A prince ruling in Tabriz or Sarai, surrounded by Persian scholars, Turkic warriors and Russian merchants, did not live in the same mental world as a Khan on the Kurlan River. Their concerns were different. Their advisors were different. Their enemies and allies were different. Slowly, what had begun as one empire under one tent began to feel more like a federation of related, sometimes competing, khanates. They could still cooperate for major campaigns, as they did in the massive invasion of Europe under Batu and Subutai. But loyalty to the abstract idea of a universal Mongol ruler had to compete with local needs, local identities, and local opportunities. Out of this complex, sometimes unstable structure came something historians later called, with a hint of nostalgia, the Pax Mongolica. For roughly a century, large parts of Eurasia from the Yellow River to the Danube, from Siberia to the shores of the Indian Ocean, were tied together under Mongol rule or under the shadow of it. Banditry along the main caravan routes was suppressed with ruthless efficiency. Merchants who once needed to bargain with a dozen petty lords for safe passage could instead carry a paisa, a small tablet of authority, and expect Mongol officials to protect them. Silk, spices, paper, and porcelain moved west. Silver, glassware, textiles, and ideas moved east. Muslim astronomers found positions in Chinese observatories. Persian physicians worked at Yuan courts. Nestorian Christian communities appeared in cities that had never heard of Rome. But pax, the word for peace, can be misleading. The relative safety of the trade routes rested on foundations of fear. The cities that resisted Mongol demands, especially in the early conquests, often paid with lives, walls, and irrigation systems. Populations were displaced. Refugees spilled into new lands, bringing their skills and their traumas with them. Agricultural regions devastated in the wars took generations to recover, if they ever did. So the era of Mongol peace was also an era of Mongol scars. For every merchant marvelling at the speed of overland travel, there were communities still living in the shadow of earlier massacres. Yet the cultural currents that flowed through this unsettled order were real. Gunpowder technology, which had developed in China, began to spread more systematically westward during and after the Mongol period, eventually transforming warfare in the Islamic world and Europe. Printing, Paper money experiments and new techniques in textile production travelled along the same networks. Medical knowledge moved as well. Mongol rulers were famously eclectic in their recruitment of physicians, employing Chinese herbalists, Tibetan practitioners, Islamic doctors trained in the Galenic tradition, each bringing their own texts and techniques. Hospitals and court infirmaries in cities like Tabriz and Kambalik became meeting points where different medical systems compared notes, sometimes harmonizing, sometimes clashing, but always adding to the pool of shared understanding. Cartography, map-making benefited enormously. Empires need to know what they rule, and Mongol conquests forced information into coherent forms. Chinese cartographic traditions, Islamic astronomical geography, and steppe mental maps of routes and rivers began to interact. Over time, this contributed to more accurate depictions of Eurasia in both East Asian and Middle Eastern map traditions, ripples that would be felt later in European charts as well. Diplomacy, too, shifted. Embassies travelled not just from subject peoples to the Mongol courts, but between far-flung states now conscious of each other's existence. European kings wrote to distant khans, hoping for alliances or at least for clarity. The papacy sent envoys across Central Asia, carrying letters of faith and cautious flattery. Treaties, hostages, intermarriages, and intelligence-gathering missions crossed and recrossed the continent on roads that Genghis and his heirs had violently cleared. People themselves moved in vast numbers. Artisans were resettled from conquered cities to new capitals. Entire populations of weavers, metalworkers, scribes, and engineers could find themselves relocated hundreds or thousands of miles away from their birthplaces, ordered to rebuild what Mongol armies had previously demolished. They carried with them techniques, stories, and memories that would quietly reshape the regions where they were planted. Somewhere in the midst of this swirl of destruction and connection, of depopulated fields and crowded caravanserais, the memory of the man who had set so much of it in motion began to harden into legend. How he is remembered depends deeply on where you are standing. In Mongolia, he is often seen as the great unifier, the founder of the nation, the man who turned scattered clans into a people with a shared story. His image appears on currency. His name graces airports and universities. The terrifying conqueror of other people's chronicles becomes, at home, a state builder and a symbol of identity recovered after centuries of foreign rule. In parts of China, particularly northern regions that bear the marks of early Mongol invasions and of the Yuan dynasty, his legacy is more ambivalent. He is both the founder of a foreign dynasty that nevertheless became part of China's imperial past, and the destroyer of older orders. Textbooks may emphasize his role as a unifier of territory, while local memories may hold on to tales of loss. In the Muslim world, especially in places that experienced the burning of cities like Nishapur or the sack of Baghdad by later Mongol forces, the association is often dark. Chroniclers wrote of rivers running black with ink from ruined libraries and red with blood from massacres. Genghis Khan's name and that of his descendants became shorthand for chaos unleashed, for a world overturned. In Europe, he was, for a long time, the distant storm that never quite arrived, a whispered threat from the east. Later, as more became known through travel accounts and scholarly work, the picture fractured again, part monstrous invader, part curious example of barbarian efficiency and discipline. Modern historians, reading across all these accounts, keep returning to the same difficulty. Was he primarily a destroyer or a creator? Did he simply ride the crest of deeper changes already forming, the revival of long-distance trade, the technological shifts of the 12th and 13th centuries, or did he amplify them into something entirely new? The answer seems to be both simpler and more unsettling. One life rarely invents the world from scratch. The conditions that made Genghis Khan possible, the ecology of the steppe, the politics of neighbouring empires, the technologies of composite bows and stirrups, the old trade routes waiting to be reopened, were in motion long before he was born. But a single life can act as a kind of lens. It can focus scattered forces into a single blinding beam for a brief time. It can align ambitions, fears, skills, and opportunities in a way that pushes history down paths that were possible but not guaranteed. The empire he left behind did not last forever. The khanates fractured, converted to different religions, adopted local languages, and were eventually absorbed into new states. The unmarked grave on the steppe remained unvisited by official pilgrimages. New conquerors arose with their own banners, their own laws, their own dreams. And yet, when we trace the roots of early global trade, when we map the spread of technologies and ideas across Eurasia, when we listen to the overlapping memories of reverence and horror that still cling to his name, we are, in a sense, still walking through the echo of his choices and of the world that formed him. If you find yourself wanting to sink a little deeper into that wider world, beyond this story, and into others like it, there is a book waiting quietly at sleepytimehistory.com. It explores these long arcs in the same slow, careful way, and for this week there is a discount. A small encouragement to keep wandering through the past with your eyes half closed. Lying here, you do not need to decide whether he was hero, villain, or something in between. You can simply notice how one outcast's stubbornness, sharpened by hardship and carried on horseback, intersected with forces far larger than himself. Empires rise and fall, trade routes open and close. Technologies diffuse and become ordinary. The people who seemed in their own time to stride across the world like giants end up as stories told in the dark. What remains in the quiet is the recognition that individual lives and vast impersonal currents are never truly separate. They twist around each other, braid together, and leave patterns that only become clear when you look back from a great distance. In that distant view, the man once called Temujin is not just a conqueror silhouetted against the steppe. He is a point where many lines met and then diverged again, sending their ripples out across centuries, all the way to this moment where his name drifts through your thoughts as sleep begins to gather at the edges of your mind. If you trace those lines all the way back, they return to a boy left on a cold hillside, abandoned with his family, hunted by rivals, trading the safety of obedience for the risk of trying to hold his own fate in his hands. From that beginning came the tentative alliances, the night meetings, the small bands of riders testing what it meant to follow someone for more than loot. Then the long, grinding work of unification, not just by slaughter, but by offering a different bargain to the fractured clans of the steppe. Then the shockwave, an empire that stretched across a third of the known world, built out of courier relays and law codes, hostage exchanges and census lists, as much as from arrows and fire. It is easy, from far away, to tell this as the story of a single will bending the world. But under the surface, you can feel the scaffolding, institutions that rewarded loyalty and punished betrayal, strategies that turned mobility and intelligence into weapons as sharp as any spear. Alliances that stitched together distant peoples who had once barely known of each other's existence. And timing, neighbouring empires in moments of weakness, trade routes waiting to be reopened, a climate and a technology stack that made fast horse warfare devastatingly effective. Our picture of all this is never perfectly clear. The sources we have, Persian chronicles, Chinese dynastic histories, later Mongol accounts, travellers' tales, were written for their own purposes, in their own moods. They exaggerate, omit, misunderstand. Historians compare them, test them against archaeology and climate data, and still there are places where we can only offer the most careful maybe. That is part of why history is not just a list of facts, but an ongoing act of interpretation. We keep returning to the same lives and events, not to fix them in place forever, but to see what they reveal about power, fear, cooperation, and chance. If you'd like to wander further back than Genghis, into those older bottlenecks and prehistoric turning points, there's a book waiting for you at sleepytimehistory.com about the long hidden prehistory that shaped every story since. You can read more about it there, and if you like, bring it into your own quiet hours. Before you drift off, if this gentle journey through the steppe has kept you company tonight, you can help it find other listeners. A like nudges the story a little further into the world. A comment, even a simple still awake or listening from, tells the algorithm that this slow pace matters. If you feel up to typing, I'd love to know where you are listening from, what city, what country, what corner of the world this distant echo of hoofbeats is reaching. And if you'd like more stories told in this slow, careful way, you can subscribe, so that the next time we follow another unlikely life through the dark, it will be waiting for you when you need it.